are either letters written to children or letters of children that later became something. And I've got several of those that I really like. For instance, I've got the earliest letter I've ever seen when she was 5 years old. It was written out by her nanny, and then she signed a Lilibet, Queen Elizabeth II, who's still with us. And it's a 5-year-old letter she wrote. And then there's a letter from Florence Nightingale at age 7 that I've got. And Florence Nightingale was like the Kennedys. She came from a family that was very wealthy, a lot of money. Didn't need to put her life on the line, which she did by going to the Crimea, taking care of and picking up, And most people don't realize that although she's famous for writing the first real book on nursing that
Florence Nightingale, right?
in 1860, but by that time she was an invalid because of things she picked up and things over in the Crimea. And most people don't realize this great lady lived for the last 40 years of her life in a wheelchair. Most people never heard that.
She had polio or
Yeah,
something?
she had everything. And they visited her in a wheelchair, this great lady. And I have a letter written at age 7 before all of that. And half of it's written in French at age 7. Her parents had taught her French or had somebody teach her. And so she's 7 years old. Half of it's to a cousin. But the end of the letter is what I like the best. She said, "By the way, cousin, my name is Nightingale, not Nightingale, the way you say it." So you kind of feel
get it right, kid.
Yeah, get it right, kid, kind of thing. But I've got a lot of things that I enjoy. You mentioned Martha Washington. I love the story of that coin, and how she had her silver melted down.
Is that probably the most...
I thought that was very, very neat.
Just tell us the story about...
Well, when the United States was first founded with her husband, of course, we kept pulling poor George
Washington,
poor George out of retirement. He just wanted to go home to Martha and invent a new line of grapes,
Yeah.
That's what he wanted. But we wouldn't let the poor guy do that. And one interesting side note on that, John Adams for years has had a bad hit up until McCullough wrote the book, on his life that kind of changed things, and some other writers. And he's starting to get some of what he deserved. But he was, John Adams was called the Atlas of our independence. Now, what's an atlas? That's by his fellows in Congress. Well, an atlas is a guide that leads you somewhere.
Right.
So he was the Atlas of our independence. He was the rabble rouser for 10 years. There were others too, like his cousin Sam, that kept raising heck, against the British.
We don't want
when many of our citizens,
control,
many of our citizens didn't want to hear that,
Yeah.
So he was really disliked by the time he's in the Continental Congress, and he knew that he could, for instance, as head of the Military Committee of Congress, it was his job to pick someone to lead our troops, along with he was the head of the committee. So he said, it has to be a Virginian, because Virginia is the great middle colony that pulls the North and the South. You have 13 warring nations. You got to bring together our colonies, and Virginia's the big middle one. It's got to come from Virginia. So he picked the Virginian, George Washington, to lead our troops. A lot of people don't realize that was Adams and his committee. He also picked the Virginian, later Thomas Jefferson, to write the Declaration of Independence, who was on his committee, because Adams, although Adams is as good or better writer than Jefferson, he knew that anything he wrote would be torn to shreds on the floor of the Continental Congress. So he picked both those men, both key appointees. Well, Washington, of course, had some great notoriety in the French and Indian War. Had survived that, and quite amazing stories from that war, where he was shot at point blank and not hit. I've got a newspaper in Washington written about the Battle of Monongahela, which took place in 1755. Our general, we were British then, was General Braddock. It'd be like Norm Schwarzkopf getting killed in battle. And when Braddock, Washington kept telling him, don't march in a phalanx, in a Roman column through the trees with those red uniforms. There's one over here, hanging up from the War of 1812, because you're great targets, Says, the French and Indians are shooting at us from the trees, and they're going to knock you out. Well, Braddock didn't believe it. He had all this history behind him, and and so going back to the Peloponnesian Wars, you line up and protect each other, and this. well, they're getting picked off, and Brant got mortally wounded at this Battle of Monongahela. He's dying. In the news article I have, it's in the Annapolis newspaper, and after it talks about the generals expiring, it said, young Colonel Washington, who would have been 23 then, young Colonel Washington came off unhurt, having 2 horses shot from under him and 4 bullets through his clothes. Now, that's in the newspaper. That's not hearsay. So the point is that somebody was looking after this guy at a young age, and we know that. And he was raised up, and he did these marvelous things, but he always knew who to credit for his achievements, and that was divine providence. That was God. They were all deeply religious men, our founding fathers, and a lot of that's been wiped out of our history, which is too bad, because that's why I like collecting their letters, to show that. I've got a letter of John Adams where he says, I don't care if you're an Armenian or a Catholic or a Protestant or whatever. He says, as long as they're Christians, I wish to be numbered with them all. Makes a real and I've got a letter of Jefferson where he talks about his last prayer being that we, the beneficiaries of the revolutionary generation, will continue to preserve the freedom that was won by the revolutionary generation. So I mean, they were all very religious people, but we've tried to not teach our kids about that, and we've lost so much of that. And that's what I love, are those letters like that. And but you're right, there are other things. We get to Martha.
Go back to Elvis.
So we get to Martha. I didn't tell the story. I didn't tell that quick. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
And that is, you asked me to tell about that. And George Washington, we pull him out again to amend the Articles of Confederation. Okay, 1787. Well, they're not amendable because these warring factions fighting in the Congress. So Washington, very reluctantly, out of a sense of duty, heads up this Constitutional Convention. They decide to throw the whole thing out and start again. Well, he was so determined not to get that leaking out that he actually nailed the windows shut in Independence Hall. By that time, it was called the Old State House. And it was a horrible hot summer with insects and flying everything. And these people were dying in those buildings, trying to do that in the building, trying to do the Constitutional Convention. Eventually, they, of course, were able to do it. And we believe, as Latter-day Saints, that those men were raised up to do that. But you have to kind of read past the lines, because they went through a lot of suffering getting that thing done in a lot of different ways. I've got a letter from Elbridge Gerry, written back to his wife at home, saying, you mistook my meeting by way of my lodgings. I meant that my being here is very uncomfortable. He said, had I known what would have happened here, nothing could have induced me to have come. I mean, we talk about our divinely inspired, but he didn't want to sign the Constitution. He didn't. But he served as our 4th vice president under it. Died in office. Yeah, so Madison's vice president. But anyway.